University. In 2005, Villanova University, together with 4 other Catholic higher education institutions across the nation, entered into a formal partnership with Catholic Relief Services, the official overseas humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic community. The purpose of this partnership is to deepen our institutions' respective and shared mission to reduce human misery and promote justice, peace, and global solidarity through collaborating in global education, research, advocacy, and service. Today's symposium on the global water crisis is an example of this collaboration. In July 2010, the United Nations General Assembly declared that access to clean water and sanitation is a human right essential to the full enjoyment of life and other human rights. The social teaching of the Catholic Church has always held that all human beings have a fundamental right to what they need to live and live in dignity. Clean water and sanitation are essential to life and dignity. Today, more than 1 billion people worldwide lack access to safe drinking water. In fact, lack of clean water is responsible for more deaths in the world than war. As the global supply of water becomes increasingly scarce and access to it more unequal, the risk of violent conflict over it increases as well. Thus, today's symposium, the Global Water Crisis, Conflict, and Cooperation, and the more specific issues related to it are matters not only of deep concern, but more of urgency to the global community. For today's opening plenary, we have 3 speakers and a respondent. I'll introduce each of the speakers now, who will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then a respondent will take 15 minutes. And after the respondent, we'll open the floor to questions for 15 minutes. And my job is, I guess, to keep us all on schedule because we have a lot of sessions after this as well. So let me start. Our first presenter is Thomas Bannett. He's the Senior Technical Advisor on Justice and Peacebuilding for Catholic Relief Services. A sociologist with a PhD from Rutgers University, Dr. Bannett has lived and worked in Brazil and the Andes with Maryknoll and Catholic Relief Services. He serves on the board of directors of the Life and Peace Institute, is also a member of the steering committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. Dr. Bannett has written on human rights, religious movements, and grassroots responses to violent conflict. He is the co-editor of Artisans of Peace, published by Ogres Books in 2003, and also Pursuing Just Peace, published by Catholic Relief Services in 2008. Jason Garrett served for 8 years with Maryknoll as an engineering advisor to the Bolivian non-governmental organization Suma Jema. He worked on water issues that range from implementing rural and semi-urban community water and sanitation projects to challenging the imposed privatization of urban water services that impact the daily lives of the indigenous people of the Andes. He is the author of Water and Conflict, Incorporating Peacebuilding into Water Development, published by Catholic Relief Services in 2009. He recently returned to public waterworks engineering with Tarrant Regional Water District in Fort Worth, Texas. He received his master's in international political economy and development from Fordham and his Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering from Texas A&M. In his free time, he serves as a volunteer and board member with Water Engineers for the Americas. Dennis Warner is Senior Technical Advisor for Water Supply, Sanitation, and Water Resources Development with Catholic Relief Services. He has over 40 years' experience in international development, working on problems of water supply, sanitation, environmental health, and emergency relief assistance. Raised in the Chicago area, he studied history and engineering at the University of Illinois, where he earned a BA, a BS, and MS degrees, and at Stanford University, where he received a PhD in civil engineering. Dr. Warner has lived in Tanzania, Uganda, Switzerland, and France, and has held positions with the Peace Corps, University of Dar es Salaam, Duke University, the World Health Organization, World Bank, USAID, and several engineering consulting firms. Dr. Warner represents CRS on the board of the Millennium Water Alliance, serves as the executive committee. In 2000, he served as representative of Pax Christi International to the United Nations in Geneva. And finally, our respondent is Francis Galgano, is the chair of the Department of Geography and the Environment at Villanova. Dr. Galgano retired from the U.S. Army in 2007 as a lieutenant colonel after 27 years of service with experience in tank and cavalry units. He served in Germany, Kentucky, Texas, Saudi Arabia, and Kansas, and most recently at the United States Military Academy, where he was an academy professor and director of the geography program. Dr. Galgano is a physical geographer with expertise in coastal geomorphology, military geography, and environmental geography. He has published 6 books, 3 physical geography study guides, and more than 20 professional articles focused on geographic and military subjects. His current research involves the study of linkages between the environment and regional stability and conflict. He earned his PhD from the University of Maryland. So we will begin then with Dr. Bandit.
Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you all for coming. Thanks for the applause before I begin. That's a good sign. When I first suggested the title that's up there, Dennis asked me if I was going to bring a guitar. But I assured him that this is the unmusical version of Troubled Waters and Bridges Over. I want to run through what I'm going to say fairly quickly, be conscious of the time, because we want to get plenty of time for discussion. So first of all, water is essential for life. Our bodies are largely made up of water. We come from water. We die fairly quickly without water. And I don't think that it's only symbolic that we have water all over the front table. It comes in handy even if you're speaking. But it is a relatively and increasingly scarce resource in our world. Less than 3% of all the water on planet Earth is fresh water. That is to say, water that one could use, one could drink from. Most of that, the vast majority of that, is locked up in glaciers or underground. So the amount of water, fresh water we have on planet Earth is actually fairly limited. And as our population grows worldwide, as the uses for industry, for agriculture, for domestic use augment, the scarcity of water becomes a more serious concern. Even more challenging is the unequal distribution of water and its quality and decision-making about it. We can easily take water for granted, especially if we have the privilege of living in a country like this. You know, we may sometimes wonder why it costs $2 for a bottle of it, but for the most part, it's not something we worry a great deal about having or not having. There are tremendous inequalities around the world in terms of access to water, and climate change is making that somewhat more difficult. As desert areas grow, increasingly numbers of people do not have access to water. And with commercialization of water, with policies of various kinds, the various mechanisms through which water is polluted, the situation becomes extremely critical. While these realities are global, the most serious issues of life and death, are played out not in this country, but especially among the poor of the world. As Dean Gabriel mentioned, there are something like 2 million people a year who die because of inadequate water or poor water quality. Most of them are children. Water is a factor in conflicts. Back about 1995, the vice president of the World Bank famously announced that the wars of the century we live in now would be water wars. In other words, not so much wars about other resources or about oil, but wars about water. Although this forecast is still possible, major international violence may be less likely than violence within countries around water and water resources. If history is any indicator, countries tend to be more likely to make treaties around water than to go to war around water. But there have been at least 40 or 50 situations in the latter half of the 20th century in which one country engaged in aggression against another country around water. About a third of those cases involved Israel and a neighbor. Most water conflicts that are recounted by NGOs like Catholic Relief Services are local in nature. They have to do with people who live downstream and people who live upstream of a water source. They have to do with contamination. They have to do with some people who have access to water and others do not have access to water. In some cases, water is at the heart of a conflict. It may have to do with a well, for example, in a drought situation. Who can get to the well? There's a case in the book that Jason worked on with us that talks about 250 people who were killed in Somalia around a well that was controlled by warlords. And getting to that well was something you had to be on their good side of to have access. More often, water scarcity or inequalities are linked to other factors: chronic poverty, ethnic and regional divisions, major policy and power conflicts. I was recently in Darfur, in the western part of Sudan, and there a great deal of conflicts involving herders, farmers, access to water. It's one piece, however, of a much broader conflict that is involved acts of extreme aggression. Water not only divides countries and communities, it invites bridge building and mutually beneficial cooperation. A study in Foreign Policy magazine by Postel and Wolf in 2001 indicates over 3,600 water-related treaties signed between countries in the modern era. That's going way back in the centuries, but a fairly substantial number of treaties. In the work that we do, water management committees are a common example of grassroots cooperation, linking communities to work together around a shared resource. Customary indigenous practices, including reverence for water, including patterns for sharing water, are extremely important and need to be tapped into. And women who so often bear the brunt of going long distances to bring water and to carry water back to their communities have a lot of experience and wisdom to offer around water and its scarcities and its inequalities and the need for connections. What about peace building? That's my title. I'm supposed to be a senior advisor on justice and peace building. There was a time when peace building largely was used to refer to what happens after the violence. The United Nations, for example, referred to peace building as a post-conflict set of actions. But increasingly, for the UN and academic centers and NGO work, peace building refers to the whole range of things. If we think about conflict in terms of a curve, where we have a stage before conflict that can be prevention, we have conflict escalating to its worst expressions and then declining. At any point in that, there are things that one can do that we can consider peace building. So peace building is something we build when we prevent tensions from escalating into the exercise of violence, when we limit the scale of destruction, injuries, and death, or we help to rebuild and reconcile people after they've been engaged in violent acts against one another. CRS's peace-building strategy focuses on increasing equity or fairness, social cohesion that ties people together within a country, and working with local partner organizations. And above all, our partner of preference is Catholic Church organizations. There are a number of peace-building principles that we tend to use. There are about 10 in number, but I'll quickly mention 3 or 4 that I think are most significant for this work. First of all, we seek to respond to root causes in conflict, and not just their effects or their symptoms. So we look to long-standing grievances, to inequalities between communities or regions, or ethnic groups, to policies that may advantage or disadvantage one group or another. Secondly, we try to build on local knowledge and experience. In Africa, for example, the custom of elders gathering to make decisions about conflicts in their communities, customary law of various kinds. Thirdly, it's important that we be grounded in community-defined needs and ownership. It's very dangerous to come in as an outsider without the necessary humility and try and suggest what has to happen. It's extremely important that we work with communities around what they see as needs and around things that they will define as their own. Finally, it's important to include advocacy for justice as well as direct, practical kinds of initiatives. So this means looking at policies, institutions, systems. A couple last slides. Integrating or mainstreaming peace building. Where and when possible, in CRS and in other NGOs, we try to have water and sanitation development projects seek to integrate elements of peace building. And what does it mean to integrate or to mainstream peace building? Well, we sometimes say you have to be hip if you're going to integrate. And that means, first of all, H for holistic in scope. Looking at integral development, human development, as the Dean was mentioning before from Catholic social teaching. Looking at the whole person, all of their needs, the community's needs, and not merely a specific technical sector that an engineer or a health specialist or a peace building specialist might look at. We seek to be holistic. Secondly, intentional in design. We don't just want to sort of bumble into integration. There was an example in northern Ghana, for example, of CRS work around microfinance, where they discovered that the small savings and lending communities were helping to bring together communities that were formerly divided. But it was not in the design. It was something that happened, it was serendipitous, it was fortuitous, but it wasn't planned. So integrating means being intentional in design. And finally, professional incompetencies. And this means any sector that's involved should be involved in a professional kind of way. You don't go in with your top engineers around water and a couple people who took one course in peace building and say, okay, we're going to integrate because we've got both represented. You need to have professional competencies across the board. Final slide. Be always conflict sensitive. You can't always integrate justice and peace building concerns into every project. Sometimes because the donors of a given project are not going to permit it. It's just not the way it was designed. But even if a water project or another initiative does not or cannot integrate justice and peace building, it should always be conflict sensitive. Conflict sensitive, we could talk about this more, means to do no harm, if we can take that medical term. Being attentive to what divides and connects people and trying to build bridges rather than run the risk of sharpening divisions between people. A conflict-sensitive organization or a conflict-sensitive project, first of all, understands the conflict context in which you're operating. Even if it's not a violent context, what are the lines of division in that community or between those communities or between those countries where you may be working? What do you need to be attentive to? This means good analysis of the context. Secondly, understand the dynamic within the context. You need to think about the scenarios of what are going to be the effects of the intervention that you're considering. And you need to monitor what's going on. And so therefore, thirdly, you act to avoid negative impacts and maximize the positive results for the people you're seeking to serve, the people that are in need. So my final words, when possible, integrate anytime, be conflict sensitive. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As as Tom mentioned, we've all heard the headline, huh? That the next wars between nations are going to be over water. And while that's a hotly debated prediction, where there is general consensus and widely acknowledged is that we have rising violence, rising tension and conflict at the local levels within nations. And that's due increasingly and primarily due to water scarcity. I've been asked to share with you examples of water conflict that I've encountered in my 8 years as a marine island missionary in Bolivia, and from several short visits to El Salvador. And, so we'll go ahead and begin. This map here shows you how a large percentage of the human population is going to be facing this issue of increasing water scarcity. I'd like to begin with water services privatization. And begin with kind of a blanket statement, which is always fairly dangerous, but I think it's generally safe to say that whenever you try to mix maximizing profits for your shareholders and meet the water needs of a growing impoverished population, you're going to have conflict. In this case, it may happen sooner, as was the case in Cochabamba in 2000, in which Bechtel was on site for really only 6 months of its 40-year concession contract before the people rose up and basically booted them out. Or it might be later, as was the case of El Alto, La Paz, where Suez was in place for about 8 years before the same thing occurred. And typically, it boils down to what I see as 3 primary causes of that water conflict. Often it's not a decision that's autonomously made by the people themselves. In these cases, they were conditions for foreign loans, structural adjustment policies, and multilateral institutions. Secondly, they often have weak regulatory bodies. And so while water privatization may work in a country like France, where you have a strong regulatory body looking out for the interests of the consumers, that's just often not the case in these developing countries. Another cause of conflict is whenever you hear mining going on, you can expect to have conflict in that area. It's perhaps due to the tremendous amount of water that is extracted for the startup of mining and for the operations of mining, as well as the contamination of water. This contamination due to acid mine drainage can go on for decades, even after a mine's been closed. In this case of Wainuni, a state-run tin mining operation in Bolivia, one of the oldest and largest. You can see there that the tailings from the mill operation actually were dumped directly into the river that passed through the community. It was an absolute wasteland, like none other I've ever seen in my life. And it went on for miles and miles downstream. The highly acidic waters, the heavy metals, the salinity. And in this case, what occurred is the 60 communities downstream for 20, 30, 40 miles joined together with support of a local church organization, came together and began realizing, look, this is a historically run, historically mining favorable region. And we don't want to shut down this mine, but our demand is that at least the water that passes through here that we used to irrigate with return to a sufficient quality so that we can continue to irrigate. It affected the fishing cooperatives downstream as well, and Lago Coco. It used to be a dozen fishing cooperatives, now down to perhaps just 1 or so. Similarly, in El Salvador, which doesn't have the history of mining that Bolivia does, it's a densely populated small country that's taken a stance of basically opposing any kind of open pit mining with the use of cyanide. It's been very interesting. When I was there 2 years ago, the Archbishop of Salvador, I believe was a chemical engineer before becoming the bishop, who took a vocal stance against mining, was actually being harassed. The mining interests were busing protesters to follow him from public event to public event. And more seriously, as you can see here, 3 community leaders in this area of Alaskan were actually executed or assassinated. Their crime being that they just demand that mining be ecologically sustainable or that it not occur. So as you can see, this issue of water and conflict is really life and death. I'd like to touch a little bit on the issue of urban contamination of water resources. Take, for example, El Alto La Paz, about 2 million people nestled right below these beautiful Andean snow caps. You can see the water coming downstream and see why the indigenous consider it, they consider it the veins of the Pachamama, of the Mother Earth. But as it passes through the city, you have your industrial, your residential, your commercial waste being dumped into the open creeks often because the existing sanitary sewer system only reaches maybe a third of the population. And then in this case, you also have all the blood from the municipal slaughterhouse as well. It's just shocking sights. Sometimes you see people making a living downstream standing on this, trying to extract sand for construction. Likewise, the landfill is located just upstream of the community. And there was actually an attempt here to capture the leachate passing through the landfill. But as it was being built, you could see they were pumping just directly into the stream as well. All of that would pass through the city, go downstream and lead to Lake Titicaca, which is a separate lake in the Andes. And as you can imagine, the conflicts that arise with communities downstream of the city. Taking advantage of, speaking of El Alto La Paz being run with snow caps all around, the issue of climate change. The glaciers there in full retreat. This glacier here, Chacataya, used to be the world's highest ski slopes. This photo was taken in 2007. During my 7-8 years there, it had dwindled in 2 patches of ice, and most recently when I went a couple months ago, it was completely gone. What does this mean as far as conflict? I was speaking with the director of the water utility there for the 2 million people, and he was saying, what we do know is that we're going to have more extreme weather events, and we're going to have to be building more reservoirs, more and larger reservoirs to capture the runoff from the mountains. And I can assure you, anytime you have dams being built, you're going to be having water conflict as well. I think it's important we bring up the fact that there are often political interests at play. And if we're leading development efforts overseas, it is primarily the responsibility of the local government to help meet the water and sanitation needs of its people. In this case here in Salvador, campesinos who were suffering under a drought were being forced to affiliate themselves with the political party in power before they could get their donated goods. Likewise, what seemed like a wonderful development effort on the part of the government to form a fishing cooperative in one location, on the surface looked to be great, but actually when you spoke to the people, come to find out there was already a fishing cooperative there that just so happened to have affiliate itself with the other political linear. And so instead of meeting water needs, really there was some discord. Finally, this issue of our own efforts of community development overseas. Nobody wants to be doing any harm, but these things can occur. Conflict can follow. We often deal with very rigid budgets. Here in the States with public works, we don't even hold our engineers to the expectation that there'll be no flaws in design. If there's legitimate needs, there's change orders. There's a process for that. Often we don't have that. The budgets can be so rigid overseas that, for example, in the case of San Pablo de Aquina, we installed a system for 200 families. We ran about $2,000 or $3,000 short. We couldn't buy the pump to fill the system. It lingered on for a few months, and people just got fed up. They realized they had an international cyclone event passing through the community, and they sent out a manifesto saying, we're blockading this event. If you guys don't give us the funding, we need to finish the system. I can assure you it's no fun to be in a meeting for 4 hours the night before the cyclone event with 100 angry citizens, but we got through it. But it's just to show you, not having that flexibility in budgeting can lead to conflict. The Andean high plains where we live, I can't tell you how many of these beautiful elevated tanks you see. Great infrastructure. But after 5 years, I would guess, based off what we've seen, that it might be a 50-50 chance that there's actually water in those tanks, especially in the smaller communities. Because take, for example, this tank here was built where there was a community of 35 families. Once there's no problem with the tank, it's that motor pump down in the well. Sooner or later, those things are going to freeze up, and they're going to be repaired or fixed. It's going to cost $400 or $500. And for families that make $2 a day, before being able to meet that need, they'll just go back to their prior water sources. And so you have this, this reminder of a failed attempt at a community effort. Finally, one of the last things we want to do is divide a community when we're overseas. This village of San Juan Dos in El Salvador had these beautifully designed rain catchment tanks, but the funding for the NGO that did it only reached half the community. And so the other half of the community, the families were just seething with resentment. That's why they were left out of this project. So a good effort, good intentions, a divided community full of conflict. I just wanted to say, it might appear that I'm a messenger of doom and gloom, but actually, in most all of these cases, there were tremendous grassroots efforts at transforming those conflicts. Grassroots efforts that were often accompanied by foreigners, either on the ground or back here in countries like the States. And so I'm excited about what we're going to be trying to achieve here through this conference. I appreciate you being here. Thank you very much, or as Amara would say, huge pagar puni.
You don't have to say good afternoon. I'd like to build on the comments that Tom gave on what is peace building and what constitutes it, and what Jason explained to you about some of the kinds of conflicts that occur in water programs. What I want to do is show what are the CRS water programs and peace building programs and how we're trying to bring them together. And where do we go from here on this important issue? So I'll look at both of the sectors first and then try to show what we want to do. CRS has been in the water business, the water sector business, for a long time, more than 50 years. CRS has been around for more than 60 years. We currently are working in 40 countries. It's hard to tell because countries come in and they come out depending on how long programs last. And we're currently spending approximately $40 million on water-related activities around the world. Our major programs include water supply and sanitation for communities. This is the domestic part, the kind you often see pictures on CNN, people in villages having great needs for basic services. But we also work on issues of hygiene promotion, the area of ecological sanitation, which uses waste as a resource, not as something just to get rid of. Emergency response and irrigation, home gardens, and the area of integrated water resources management. Our programs are all around the world, so we truly are global in that area. The vision of the water sector is to assist countries to achieve their Millennium Development Goals, to participate in innovative partnerships with various organizations, including universities. And one of the reasons we're here at Villanova is to try to build a partnership here. We want to promote integrated water resources management. Promote integrated water resources management, because human beings do not live in a sectoral world. It's intersectoral, it's everything. So one can't look at development as a focused thing on a very specific type of discipline. And we want to provide advice and guidance to U.S. government agencies and others that are doing this kind of work around the world. Now let's look at peace building. It also has a long, storied history in CRS, more than 50 years. But it's very interesting. In the early years of peace building, conflict mitigation, peace building, was viewed as something that happened after the problem occurred. In the early 1990s, CRS, you might say, had a wake-up call, if I can characterize it for the peace-building people, in that the war in the Balkans occurred, and especially the genocide in Rwanda. In Rwanda, where CRS had been working for more than 35 years, and it was a 99% Christian country, most of them were Catholics, the church had been there for a long, long time, we were surprised at the level of violence that broke out. So a wholesale rethinking of peace building had to occur, and aspects of looking at the issues before conflict occurred. And that's where Tom brought in the issue of looking at the root causes of conflict, of violence. And CRS developed what is called the justice lens, which is based on CRS guiding principles. Let me just say here, peace building is global also. We're operating in more than 50 countries, a budget of 25 million. It's hard to identify these things specifically, but that's good enough for general understanding. And the programs are very broad: reconciliation, social justice, youth and violence, women's legal rights, interfaith cooperation, and so on. It's very broad. The CRS Principles, which now inform the way we look at peace building, and they inform the way all of our development programs in CRS evolve and are planned and implemented, they're based on Catholic social teaching. These are the main elements, just the titles of major issues: dignity and equality of the human person, the rights and responsibilities of all stakeholders, social nature of humanity, the common good, subsidiarity, nobody ever knows what that means, but that means decision-making at the lowest possible level, solidarity, option for the poor, and stewardship. It's interesting, I've never found anyone of any organization, of any political leaning, of any faith-based leaning who could disagree with any of these things. They are so good and so general. CRS as an organization has experienced and has been involved in many conflicts, not as a conflict provider, but we're either a witness or trying to do something about it. And the wars are the ones that stand out in people's minds. And over the past 20 years, we've had major type conflicts in Sudan, Colombia, Palestine, Angola, Bosnia, Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, and there are more. Conflict can arise, as Tom indicated, and as Jason showed you, over a variety of issues: competition over resources, over access, over power, religious, ethnic, and legal injustices, and human rights violations. The peace-building vision that CRS adopted at a major gathering in the year 2000 is to build a culture of peace throughout the world based on a foundation of justice and cooperation. And that's not just the responsibility of the peace-building sector, that's the responsibility of CRS. Now the challenge here is not just to define and understand and analyze. The challenge, as I see as in one of the development sectors, is to formulate methods and approaches that allow us to incorporate peace-building principles and concepts into our practices and activities in the field. And it's not easy. That's what we're struggling with now. In the overall water sector, the types of conflicts that we have experienced in the last few decades are arising from the fact that our work is expanding in this sector, especially in the area of water supply, sanitation, services for communities. And as you know, CRS works in the poorest communities of the poorest countries. So we're working in resource-poor environments. We're working with the human resources are weak, the financial resources are poor, environmental problems are immense. So it's extremely difficult, and these are often breeding grounds for various types of conflict. They may not be violent at first, but if they're not dealt with, they will grow and fester sometimes into violent problems. So we have issues arising over water scarcity, the ownership of water sources, allocation of water supplies, the management practices for which how the systems are operating, the water quality that people are forced to use, the costs of water, national policies, and so on. So as I said, we need practical tools, and that's what we are trying to do at this time, and this is what we are hoping this symposium will help us along this path. So very quickly, I'm going to show you what we're trying to do now and in the future. Over the last few years, we've been developing the concept of trying to integrate peace building into water development, where there are conflict situations, beforehand, during, and after the conflict. Our work started just a few years ago in 2007, when we began to look at the issue. We developed some studies and some concept papers over that time. One of the things we did was send Jason to Central America to use his experience from South America to look at real conflicts and try to understand how they interacted with water, with people, and what are some of the motivating factors that bring up conflicts. And this resulted in a very good book, Water and Conflict, which was published in 2009. This year, at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, which is a major think tank, we had a panel discussion on water and conflict, which was televised live on C-SPAN, in which this issue was discussed with experts from USA, Georgetown, CRS, and it was a very good event, and perhaps 300 people attended. It was an overflow crowd. And this year we've continued with the field work. Jason's gone into the field, another consultant for us has gone into the field, and we're looking for partners to work with us on this. We hope this symposium will give us new ideas and help us ratchet up our understanding and our progress a bit further. So our next steps in this issue of incorporating peace building into water development. We will continue to review the information that's coming to us. We want to prepare action plans. And we want to do this with partners, university partners, other non-governmental organizations, wherever there are institutions and individuals who are interested in grappling with these very important issues. Next year, we hope to hold a global workshop to bring many of these things together. Eventually, we want to develop guidelines, to develop practical tools for peace-building ideas and concepts in water projects, so that our country offices, which are building water projects, we can say, here's some guidelines for you to use. Right now, we don't have them. The problem is to bring the ideas down to practice. And then eventually, we want to develop for CRS a global strategy on water development and peace building, so that issues such as some of these horrible wars and high-level conflicts of the past, well, we may not be able to eliminate them, but we certainly hope to reduce the likelihood that they happen. So that's our progress, and we thank you for being here, and maybe we will all be able to work together on this. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to once again extend thanks to our speakers for bringing us their expertise and their thoughts. Please, I'd like to thank them once again. So the general thrust of what we heard today was troubled waters, and I think that's very appropriate. And our speakers brought to our attention the value of water, the linkages between water and conflict, the linkages between water and peace building, and really what it articulates for us is that water is really a perplexing and probably one of the more intractable issues that we face. Water is finite. There's only a tiny amount of fresh water available to us. Only 3% of the Earth's water is fresh water, and of that, only about 0.92% of it is readily available to humans. So water cannot be created, at least not cost effectively. So what we have is all that we have, and water is and should be a renewable resource, but the amount of non-sustainable practices in various parts of the world make it troubling. So if I think like a geographer, for me the issue becomes one of scale, which I'll talk about. Very seldom are truly perplexing water problems at a local scale. They're usually at some sort of regional scale, which means we're dealing with multiple ethnic groups, multiple tribal groups, multiple states. And water is usually viewed as a sovereignty issue when we're talking about more than one nation. So that makes it a very difficult thing to deal with. And in our attempts to work with water, there are always unintended consequences because we're dealing with a large, self-sustaining natural system, the hydrologic cycle, and whenever we intervene at some smaller level, usually at the larger level, we create problems. So this was supposed to work very nicely for, there we go. See if we can get, there you go. So one of the immutable facts that we got from our three speakers here is that water is an essential resource. First of all, it is essential to human life. It's essential for agriculture, which in turn provides food security and is also part of that essential part of human life. It's essential for ecosystem viability, and it's essential for industry and development. We've heard about mining, but just the day-to-day things that we need. And again, if we think of that very small volume of water that's available to us to use fresh water, the amount of extraction is accelerated. The amount of water is spatially inconstant across the surface of the Earth, and that creates some difficulties for us. I leave you with this one economic notion. From 1950 to about now, the global population grew by 3 billion people. And with that, economic output from across the world grew at about a factor of 4. We expect by 2050 to add perhaps another 3 billion people, or certainly by the end of this century. And in order to sustain that population growth, we'll have to expand economic output by a factor of 5. And all of that requires water, and they are all competing problems. So the amount of water generates some problems for us. Now this guy right here, that's me. This isn't a place where there's absolutely no water. This is the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia. Actually may be in Yemen in this picture, I'm not sure. The border's indistinct, and, so you don't know where it is. But you can drive across this area for hours, there's no water. The only people who are here are Bedouins, and they move from one watering hole to another. They're spaced at about 75 or 100 miles apart. As a young man growing up in Long Island, spending my entire life in the United States, and then eventually going over to Europe, spending a short time in Egypt, but then finally getting here where my water ration was 3 gallons of water a day. And it had to be delivered by helicopter. There's no water. Really got to understand the true finite value of water. That was my water to drink, to get cleaned up. It had to go into the engine of our truck, and that's all we had. Water's heavy. It's about 6.5, 7 pounds a gallon. So the helicopters, they can't. There was about 100 of us out there in 4 or 5 little teams. So we had to kind of live on what we did. And there was no well water here or anything else to dig up. So water is, when you're in a place like this, most Americans don't understand the true value of water, and this was an important lesson for me. I did get to grow a beard. I didn't didn't shower for 47 days. That was good. Most of these clothing are buried out there in the desert, never to return, and only to be found by archaeologists many years from now. So one of the constants that's dictating much of the global water problem is this idea of global environmental change. Now, what you see there before you, this is the late Holocene temperature curve. It's the temperature anomalies from the end of the Little Ice Age until present. And most of us think of this as global warming, which it is, but really the problem is much bigger than that. There's global warming, but there's also anthropogenic and natural desertification. I study sea level rise. As sea levels rise, it is linked to coastal aquifers. And as sea levels go up, there's saltwater intrusion in coastal aquifers. The problem is, most of the world's population depends on those coastal aquifers. So the idea of this is a global problem that's forcing changes at many different scales that we have to deal with. And there are large weather patterns that we have to deal with, large climatic patterns. We all know about El Nino. And for our students in the audience, of course, the great Chris Farley told us that El Nino is Spanish for the Nino. All right, that's my attempt at humor today. In any event, these are the problems that we face. So water resources, they're a dilemma. Okay, water is a renewable resource, but per capita use is going up all over the world. Populations are accelerating at the highest rates in the places with the lowest amount of available water. About 1 to 2 billion people, and that's a big number, do not have access to clean, fresh water. And as was mentioned, about 75% of the world's poorest inhabitants are subsistence farmers and essentially getting their water on a day-to-day basis as a matter of personal initiative. There is no water faucets, there's no Wawa or 7-Eleven, and this occupies most of their daily life. And the other issue is developing states are struggling. Governance is an increasing problem in much of the developing world. They lack the technical expertise and the finances. The finances that they have can deal with day-to-day problems, but long-term solutions to large-scale water problems, the money is just not there to take care of them. I also like to think of this idea of scale, and I think this really points to some of the problems that we have with water. It is a confounding global and regional issue. So if you think for a moment, most watersheds, they don't adhere to any boundaries, and they certainly don't adhere to state boundaries. If we take the world's 200 largest rivers, 50 of them cross more than 2 states, some of them 9 or 10 states. The other 150 are sort of in the 2 to 3 state range. And again, this is a sovereignty issue for most states. And many of the adjacent states are already hostile to one another. So this creates a problem for us. Water resources span geomorphic and climatic boundaries. We have rivers that start in humid areas like the Nile, and then traverse desert areas by way of example. So we have that problem. And the issue of environmental change extends across regional boundaries as well. Things like desertification, groundwater extraction, all of these things are not local, but they are sort of regional and global areas. So as our speakers talk to us, this is not a gloom and doom issue. It requires concentrated, integrated solutions at local and regional levels to solve these problems. And I will, as you go through today's conference, and I'm familiar with what other speakers are going to talk about, remember my idea here is that dealing with water, you're dealing with a large-scale natural cycle, and you always must deal with the law of unintended consequences. Fixing one problem over here will generate another problem in another area. So with that, we will open it up for questions. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Maybe you could use the microphone.
All right.
Is it on?
No. I don't know how to turn it on.
Well, go ahead and ask it, I'll repeat it for you.
Okay. Since you said that water is not readily available to the majority of people, and you just said that the rule of unintended consequences, how do you feel about the Alaskan water source that's being sold to like foreign countries? You know what I'm talking about?
I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, it's a company in Texas. It's called S2C Global. I don't really know the whole name of it, but they're outsourcing water from Alaska to India and other like third world countries for profit. So I just want to know how you guys feel about that.
Did everybody get the question?
Okay.
These folks did.
Okay.
So there's, actually, if you saw the recent issue of Newsweek magazine on water problems, they talked about a number of companies that are starting to form, which is the one that you mentioned, is one of them, that are starting to essentially market water from those areas of the world where there is a lot of water in low population areas. Canada is a good example of that. And I guess the question is, what's the panel's thoughts on that as a commercial enterprise?
Well, I'm not familiar with this particular case, but the issue of selling water internationally has been something of a hot topic for many years. But water is a resource like other resources, minerals, agricultural products, wood, and I think it's fair game to be part of an economic system of sales. What one does not want to have is locking up that resource or committing that resource to other parties for an indefinite period of time. Just as one can say, well, we're not going to sell any more forest cuttings to foreign countries, we should be able to say that for water also. But if water is abundant at any given time, why should it not be part of international trade?
Any other responses? Okay, other questions?
Should I try from here?
Yes, and I'll repeat.
Should I walk up to the microphone?
Go ahead.
My question is for anybody in Catholic Relief Services. In this discussion, you've talked about combining peacebuilding and water projects. And I can understand water projects save a lot of lives, intestinal disease, a lot of children. Any successful project is going to involve local buy-in, and probably conflict comes in there someplace too. But I'm wondering what your process was to bring in peacebuilding as a major goal. It looks like on the same level with sanitation and drinking water, committing extensive resources to it also. And maybe those projects are really beyond your ability to deal with, and maybe you ought to stick to the water. I'm wondering how you trade those off.
I guess we're microphoneless.
No, that's working.
Why is that?
Does this work?
Yeah, that's working.
Hello? Yeah?
Yes, it's on.
Thanks. Is it on?
They can hear it.
All right, this one sounds a lot more, deep. Within CRS, as the history goes, because I was with Maryknoll for about 22 years, and I've been with CRS for about 5.5. But as the story goes, there was a time when CRS focus was basically one of people of goodwill trying to help people in need. It began, of course, after the Second World War, during the Second World War, actually, to help refugees. CRS then went into a period of time where it focused on technical competency in particular kinds of areas, began to move more into development sectors. But particularly with the wars in the Balkans and Rwanda, there was a tremendous wake-up call, as Dennis said. 1994, CRS had been working in Rwanda for decades and decades doing great development projects and had been aware of the conflicts between the Tutsis and the Hutus with what was going on. But that was not something CRS was supposed to deal with. That was not in the portfolio. And so when the massacre began, 800,000 people died. So much, not only of human lives, but also of development work and so on, just went down the tubes. And it was a shakeup for CRS leadership. I wasn't there at the time. But it really made them say, what are we doing in all these cases where we're working in development sectors and we're not paying attention to the social justice issues, to the conflict issues. If we are a Catholic organization, we should be committed to these kinds of things as part of our identity. And so as Dennis mentioned, particularly when we had the World Summit in the year 2000, there was this focus on using a justice lens for all of our work and increasingly getting into peace-building work. So it was really that particular experience that jarred the organization, I would say, into taking it seriously. Now that said, the peace-building sector of our budget today is probably 3 or 4% of what we do. What we do with HIV and AIDS, what we do with emergency response when there's a tsunami or something like that is far, far larger. But in terms of the priorities for the next couple of years, global health, global food security, which would certainly include the water sector, emergency responses and peace building, those are the 4 corners of the strategy.
Hold on to that up there, and I'll see if I can't get this one. No. No, this isn't working.
This one works.
It does work?
Yeah, okay. Any other questions?
I was just wondering how you all felt about the Water for the World Act that was fairly recently, I guess, given support in the Senate and now it's going through the House, and if you thought that it incorporated any ideas of peace building or that sort of message behind it at all into the bill.
The Water for the World.
Yeah, it's not, just need to get
Water
that
for the
little closer.
World Act.
You gotta get really close, I think.
The Water for the World Act, as you say, it's passed the Senate, it's in the House now. It's a follow-on to an earlier act 5 years ago called Water for the Poor Act of 1995, which was signed by President Bush. And that, for the first time, made water and achieving one of the goals of the Millennium Development Goal process an official policy of the United States. And to this date, the MDG for water is the only officially accepted goal in legislation. The Water for the World Act takes it further by putting much more specificity into what the U.S. will do. The earlier act says the U.S. will give priority to poor countries and to the poorest of poor countries, and they will focus on water supply and sanitation of a domestic nature. Because USAID was doing very little of this work at that time. They had lost all of their activities in water supply sanitation of a domestic nature. Water for the World then gave it some legs by putting some numbers, saying the U.S. will seek to serve 100 million people with water supply and sanitation at the household level, and work harder to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Those of us who work in this area are very much in favor of having the Water for the World Act passed. We were overjoyed when the Senate approved it. Then the next battle would be in the House. The big question is, will this rump session of Congress pass the Water for the World Act in the House? Because the fear is the conservative nature of many of the incoming congressmen will be of a cost-cutting mode, not an expansionary mode, in all areas, including international development. So our fear is, unless it is done in this session, in the next month or so, it won't happen. And most people who are close to the congressional issues say the bill will not come up again in this next 2-year session of Congress.
I couldn't help but focus in on the contamination issues on those slides that we saw, whether it's slaughterhouse runoff, pesticides, mining heavy metals, and so on. What type of expedient solutions can be done for these areas so that people can have fit water to drink?
Thank you. I share your same concern. I really think the rivers and the streams of our world are really in a sorry state. In this case of Wainuni, for example, working closely in this latest visit I had with the communities, the grassroots organization there, what we're going to do is we're going to help partner that organization that needs the technical exchange information with geologists, with engineers out in New Mexico who are wanting to do exactly this, kind of on a pro bono nature through this organization, Water Engineers for the Americas. So I think that kind of north-south technical exchange, there's a lot of desire, I think, on the part of people here in the north who have the expertise to collaborate and participate, and we need to form those kind of partnerships. Another one that the UN is currently promoting is, for example, the Global Water Operators Partnership, trying to partner up utilities in the north with utilities in the south, the public-public arrangement. So I think if we can somehow promote those interchanges, because technically it is difficult. It's much more difficult to treat wastewater, to treat, contained mining tailings and so forth. And there's not much experience with it overseas in developing countries. So there's a legitimate need there for some technical exchange. So that's where I pin my hope.
My question is related in a way to the previous question. What about wasteful use of water? I speak as an economist. If water is a scarce resource, we should be able to cut down on the wasteful uses of water. Now I know interspatially we cannot do much about it. In tropical areas where water is scarce, whereas in Canada water may not be that scarce, we cannot transport water from Canada to tropical areas. But what about intergenerational justice? If we are careful in this generation about our wasteful uses, we are taking care of our future generations. Is there any effort given to this kind of education?
You have the smile, so you get it.
Well, I think one of the interesting issues, and certainly the United States of America, is that we don't really pay very much for water at all. It is a remarkably cheap resource. I've lived in desert parts of our United States which actually pay less for water than I pay here in the Philadelphia area now. So you would have to convince one of the whips that we would use, certainly to educate the American public, is put a true value on water. I don't know what that is, so I'm not going to try to tell you, but we don't pay a lot for water. Much of it's subsidized by our local governments and our state governments. We just don't want to pay for a lot of water. So if I told you your water was going to go to $15, $20 a gallon, which might cost someplace else, you would not be a happy person. That to me is the big stick. I worked on a booklet for Operation Warm a couple of years ago, and really opened my eyes when I came to understood that it takes the equivalent of 3 gallons of water to make one small plastic bottle of water that you see, when you buy it. It is incredibly wasteful to do that, but it's a matter of convenience. Everybody wants to throw the water bottle in their kid's lunch bag and everything else. So our economy now has conditioned us to these things. So it is a problem educating the public on what is wasteful water and what isn't. We water our lawns. We do all sorts of remarkable things. I lived in El Paso, Texas for 3 years, and there were
the most remarkable green lawns down there, and it doesn't rain but 3 or 4 times a year. So that is a problem within our country. It's a problem within most Western and developed countries where there is water. It was a problem in Saudi Arabia where I lived because they had the fortitude to be able to desalinize, so they had water, all the water they wanted. It was essentially free. So there are places where water is cheap, it's inexpensive, and water waste, as I believe, is conditioned by consumerism. So I don't have the short answer on how to change that, but that is an issue. And you're right about the ability to transfer water. She mentioned I was not aware of the thing in Canada, but transporting water around the world is not very efficient. It's not very cost effective, and eventually, I think it's gonna cost itself out. So.
I think I have one more.
One more. Okay, one more question. Philip. This is my student, by the way.
You know, what CRS is doing is admirable. It's wonderful. But we're dealing with water. As you said, it's a finite thing. Something like 2% of the water is drinkable or usable. Population is growing. I don't know, in 50 years it'll be 1 billion or 2 billion more people. So since the water is finite, and even if you use the water users use the best practices, we're going to run out of water. Now it seems to me the answer is desalinization, which you say is too expensive. But I don't know what too expensive means if you don't have it, if you don't have water.
We'll have to make this short.
Any short answer?
I wish I had the answer. The expense of desalinization arises from it's a high energy intensive activity. And to do vast amounts of desalinization, you need vast amounts of energy inputs. Countries in the Middle East, which have enormous oil reserves, can do desalination for community use. It's hardly used anywhere else on a regular basis, only more often on a special basis. There are no simple answers. Costs will go up, usage will go down, and people will have to learn to adjust. And this brings up the potential for greater conflict as the tensions arise between communities, between sectors, between countries. It's a challenge for all of us as human beings to try to deal with the future of our planet. And we can't wait till the future comes to deal with it. We have to start now.
I'll just add, just quickly to that as we pointed out, there's 3% of the water that's available to us to drink. Of course, everybody looks around and realizes that there's a lot of water on this planet, more than enough for everybody, but it's in salt water. So I think the hope, I'll speak for science and technology here, is that we can bring down the cost of things like desalinization, perhaps moving water around, making it easier to do. Some of that work is going on. I know it is one of the grand challenges that the National Academy of Engineering has put forward, is to create greater access to clean water. It's also a push within the National Science Foundation, looking at all different kinds of strategies for it. So rather than put a complete doom and gloom picture on the end of this, I'm hoping as a technologist that there will also be some technical solutions. When it becomes so important that we have to do it, then we need a moonshot for that as well. You want me to do it? She can do it. Oh, okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellen Salmi and I'm a co-chair of Water for Oslala, which is a student group on campus that works on advocating about the world water crisis and building water systems in impoverished areas of Nicaragua. This Wednesday is Water Awareness Day here on campus, and we have a table upstairs in the Connolly Center where you can sign letters pushing our congressman to support the Water for the World Act. as well as take part in the Solidarity Tank on Wednesday, which we're going to set up 2 major tanks at the Oreo, and you can sign a pledge to have that be your only water for the entire day. Go and fill up a water bottle, and just really live in solidarity. Take a mindful inconvenience of your day to use that as your only water source all throughout the day. And we're trying to make it a big event on campus. So thank you, Dr. Toten, for letting me make this announcement.
I'll hand this back to you, but I just wanted to say one last word. That is that for more information on Catholic Relief Services and its programming, please be sure to look at the table outside and sign up if you'd like more information. Also, the students who, there's a student registration sheet on the table outside. Just want to remind you that the next session, there are going to be there are actually going to be 4 more sessions. The session in here, in this room, is water for sale, measuring the cost. It's on the privatization of water. There's also going to be a session in the Radnor St. David's room, and that's not a drop to drink. That's on water, gender, and public health. Dean Gabriel, do you want to say the closing?
Did you write them on? Make sure there wasn't something that we forgot to bring. Well, first, I want to thank all our panelists. I think they certainly brought to us a whole host of issues. It's a great array of big issues, some of the technical, political issues, the complexity of this problem. And I think it's great to see certainly all our students here, because these are the kinds of problems that hopefully that you will solve as well going forward. We're going to be looking to you for some of these ideas. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully you'll be around here for the other sessions as well.